Now, as Nigeria moves to close the metering gap, we find out how the Meter Asset Provider Regulation, MAP, is shaping up. Tolulope Aderemi, a partner at Perchstone Graeys, joins me for this discussion. Tolulope, glad to have you on the show this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start first by getting your thoughts on Nigeria's power sector at this time. What do we generate for what number of people?
Okay, at the moment, I think we generate about something in the order of about 4,000 megawatts. And only as at yesterday, using a United Nations figure for around about 201 million people. So that explains to you why we have some distribution gap in terms of access to power in Nigeria.
So it's not even a question of is that enough or not enough. We know where we are with that situation. Can we just take a moment to talk about the growth constraints that Nigeria's power sector is facing? There have been talks about the power grids being down. We had a situation last Thursday in Abuja where the power grid was down, which is reminiscent of about the same situation we had, I think, in July 2018, where the power grid was down for a number of days. And the excuse at that time was that the turbines were not getting sufficient gas to power them. The one that happened in Abuja, there's been some sort of opacity around it. We have no excuse yet. But what are the constraints for growth in Nigeria's power sector?
I think the constraint for growth is just very simple. It's lack of funding. And when I say lack of funding, you can trace it from the entire value chain, right from the man who is supplying gas to the generation company, all the way to the distribution company, now to the homes of the consumer. It's widespread knowledge that the man who funds the entire value chain is the customer. Now, unfortunately, where there's no power, if I have no power in my house, why do I need to pay for power? So realistically speaking, we're having lack of funds to fund the entire. Now, about 4 or 5 years ago, you recall under President Goodluck Jonathan, about 5 or 6 years ago, NBET was set up, Nigeria Bulk Electricity Trading Company. That entity was also capitalized to bridge what is known as the funding gap. Now, what is not clear is whether government continues or wants to continue to fund NBET. Realistically speaking, it's unlikely that is the case. So because NBET is not currently funded, that explains why there is a gap between the generation companies and the distribution companies. So it's not a question of our inability to generate power, but we need to pay the man who is at the end of the ladder, which is the gas producer.
So is this a responsibility issue? Now, you've highlighted the chain now. On whose table does the buck stop?
To do what?
To fund the sector, if that's the problem. But I also know that there's also the situation of trust, like you highlighted,
correct,
from
yeah,
the consumer. If you say I should pay for power, you're not generating sufficient power. That is not the customer's problem. But if I don't get power, I don't pay.
Yeah.
Now I don't get power, I get estimated billing.
Mm-hmm.
So who should take charge and end?
So I tell you whose responsibility is to take charge, has taken charge. That's the regulator, NERC. What NERC needs to do is, 1, identify the funding constraint. 2, and be practical about it. Now, they've identified it, and they realized that where we are as a country, it's unlikely that government is able to fund it. It's also unlikely that the discos can fund it, because they've tried over the years. And in fact, what I say all the time is, if we were to be in a stricter environment, the discos licenses should have been withdrawn, because the basis for the award of those licenses was their inability to reduce their ATC and C losses.
Are you able to deliver on your promise, essentially? Yes.
Oh, yeah. So if you've not been able to deliver on it, then why hold the license? But they haven't gone that route yet, and I understand for good reasons. So what is the next thing to do? Let's be creative and see how we can move on the obligation by creating new market participants. Now, this market participant is now the MAP, and I must say that...
So is the MAP now the one-stop shop, the all-encompassing solution to the myriads of problems constraining Nigeria's power sector?
Apparently, I will say so.
How so?
And I say so because when you look at the regulation, what is done for the first time is that it's somewhat taking what appears to be the main problem, which used to reside with the DISCO, that is their ability or their statutory powers to provide meters. So under Section 67 of the EPSRA, it's the duty of the DISCO to do this, but they've not been able to do it. Now, that power has been taken away from them to the MAP. Now, the MAP is expected to source funding And that is why we have the eligibility criteria. Now, once you can demonstrate that you're able to fund the purchase of meters, then you qualify, to be a MAP. Now, there are three main scenarios that we must consider. So anybody who's interested in going into MAP must also know that it's not what it used to be. So first is I need to be secured as a MAP that any fund I go to source must also be protected or secured. The first way to secure it is government has now said, look, the consumer, you and I, can go directly to the MAP and purchase your meters. Now,
so we take off the middleman?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is called the upfront customers. So you have 36,000 and 67,000 cost of single phase and cost of three-phase meters. If you have your money, you go directly to a MAP and you purchase it.
So let's look more deeply at the rights of the customers under the MAP regulation now, which is what you are more excited about in this case. Let's talk about repairing and replacement of damaged meters. We know that there's a 10-day deadline between when the customer sources fund goes to the MAP directly, buys the meter. You've got 10 days to fix it. Now, what happens in the case where I need to have my meter repaired or replaced? Who do I go to?
So that tells you the sincerity of the regulator. What you do is first, once it is identified that a meter is bad and needs to be repaired, the regulation makes it must be repaired or replaced within 2 days. Now, this is very exciting because it puts the MAP under more pressure. Now, because we're practitioners in this area, we know the practicality of it. So what it means is if you as a customer detect that your meter is malfunctioning, you could either report to the distribution company who owns the franchise area where you reside, or you could report directly to the MAP. Either way, once a report has been made to the MAP, an investigation must quickly be conducted to determine two things. One, whether the defect was a result of the customer's error, or two, whether the defect was a manufacturer's defect. Now, in law, these are two legal consequences. Where it's a defect of a manufacturer's defect, then the warranty kicks in. So automatically, I must replace the meter at no cost to the customer. If it's a defect occasioned by the customer, then the customer must pay for it. But what the regulator have also done, and I think we need to applaud them, what they've also done is, whichever way it goes, you must replace that meter first before you now start apportioning whose responsibility it is.
I was going to ask you, how do you absolve or apportion responsibilities or blames?
So the first thing is I must close that gap.
You get the power first.
Absolutely. And what is also important is if I don't close it, I continue to lose revenue.
Tolulope, this will be a continuing conversation, but we do have to end it for here. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Tolulope Aderemi is a partner at Perchstone Graeys.